Welcome to the 31st, I believe, WharfKit call. As usual, some updates today, what's been going on over the last week or so, some decisions we've made, and then just kind of open the floor to whatever we want to talk about directional wise. Um, I guess first thing would be the atomic assets side of thing that we kind of talked about a little bit last week. We've decided internally that we're going to push forward on that. When we talked with the ENF on Friday, we let them know that this is going to take longer than we anticipated. But we've set an engineer on it full time at this point. We're still waiting to get estimates. We're going back and forth with him just to make sure he has a solid grasp on everything that needs to be done to finish it off. And we're going to let him just run on it for a while with kind of feedback from the rest of the team while the rest of the team moves off of that and onto the last couple development tasks we have for the entire project, which is crazy. And then starts really focusing in on documentation. So, and I think I mentioned this in the last call as well. Our goal was to be done with the entire project by the end of September, and that's in 4 days. That's not going to happen. The vast majority of the development is complete, and the documentation is going to be what really spills over into hopefully just October. But we are, as we saw with the blue papers and as we've seen with the documentation we've been writing so far, we get kind of stuck in our heads a lot when we're writing documentation, and it takes us longer than we think it does. So, but we're going to be pushing on that. I'm pushing on one side, Daniel's pushing on another side of that. And we are just trying to get that into a good position. So we'll see how long that takes. But from here on out, it's mostly educational material, marketing material, and then packaging of some of the existing code bases, as well as some templates. So, and then the one major outstanding development item is this Atomic Assets API client. So not even just API client, but this package of Atomic Assets type things. So we'll be providing updates on that as we move forward. Documentation, can expect to see the Antelope side expand out here in the not too distant future. This section down here that talks about the core code base. Right now it's about half done with about maybe 33% of it published. There's, like we're missing the serializer down here. We're missing public key. We're missing just a bunch of the core types and the documentation around them that I'm working on right now that will run through, get proofed, and then publish. So that way they act as good resources for those who are going to start interacting with the core types. This utilities section is also going to expand out a little bit. That's another thing I'm kind of working on. We have this common library is the only one in there right now. There's more information coming to that. And then there's going to be a few other utility sections that appear. There's 2 parts missing from the session kit that we'll be publishing. And then there will be a whole new section for the contract kit that Daniel has started on this week. And then there will be a section for the account kit. And then probably couple weeks out, there will be another section for the starter kits, which this is one of the active remaining development items. We're still kind of going back and forth on how we piece those together and make them cohesive things. Like, do we make a generic starter kit that is for everything? Do we make like a wax starter kit and an EO starter kit? Does that even make sense? These are all kind of questions that we're looking at right now and figuring out how we name. But these starter kits are basically going to be collections of packages. You'll install one dependency, and it will then come with the session kit, the contract kit, the account kit, some of the API clients, some of the wallet plugins, some of the transaction plugins, just basically like a ready-made basket of cool stuff for developers to get started in. And then in the future, if they're like, well, I never ended up using this piece, they could then, go in and manually add the dependencies that they actually want to potentially reduce their bundle size. But if they've got good tree shaking in their bundler anyways, it probably doesn't matter. It's going to get shaken out anyways. So But yeah, documentation is going to be a big focus. We're also starting to plan out and work on more educational materials. There will be more guides popping up in the guides section. One of the big ones is going to be this overall interactive guide. It's one of the line items for milestone 10 or something. Basically a walkthrough of how you build something with Wharf. That Tamagotchi that you did, Nathan, was a great example of that. And what we're going to do is something similar, except it'll be exclusively focused on the front end side of things. So maybe slightly deeper dive on that aspect of it, as opposed to dividing between contract and front end development. So the plan is that we're going to publish a contract on Jungle that anyone can interact with. And then we'll publish the code for the contract and all that other stuff on GitHub if people wanted to dive into the smart contract code side of things. But all of the educational materials will be setting up a web app to use Jungle to interact with that smart contract. And then we'll have probably some setup steps, I guess. I don't really know what to call them, but it would be like, here, go to this site and you can get a free Jungle account, and here's how you set it up, and here's how you put it in a wallet, so that way you can test your application, or how you put your private keys into the app itself to do local testing. It'll just be kind of that full walkthrough, and then building the web app in whatever framework we choose. We're kind of going back and forth on that right now. But hopefully it'll be applicable to most frameworks.
When you guys are ready, let me know, and I can throw it up on the Learn portal. It also has a way to link off to the WharfKit, as well as any downloadable resources you guys want to add in there. We'll turn a course. We'll turn it into a.
That sounds great. Cool. I think that's it in terms of like content generation that we're doing right now, which is a giant focus. Other updates, command line tool has taken a couple days of our time over the last week. We have been testing it against more and more contracts, and we ran into a couple issues. One of them was with our usage of ESLint to nicely generate the output of the code. That's resolved now. 1.4 has been released to the CLI tool today. That fixes all of this. And then some of it was around some of the way we were exporting some of the types. So it's going to be one of those projects that as more people use it, more people run it against their contract does something unique that we haven't seen in the 10 or so contracts we've used for testing. We got to go back and then modify it so that way it can interpret that contract and output the code for it. So as far as we know, like every contract everybody's raised with us works against it right now. We did update the documentation, so it does just say to use NPX. That'll always pull in the latest version, I think, although sometimes with NPX, you gotta like force at latest at the end of the package name if you have a cached version that's not getting busted for whatever reason. Otherwise, we do have the manual install still as well. So it's working well. We have used it in a couple projects now, just internal little scripts. I did one just the other day that used the session kit for the private key signing just in the local script. It used the contract kit to load tables, and it used the command line tool to create a system contract instance of the contract kit, which then just optimized everything. So we're using it to create actions and then again query tables. So it's pretty cool to actually be dogfooding this and see this working really well. And it's just a back-end script. It's not too intensive of a process, but it was super easy to write. And I think it's like 40 lines of code. And now we have a script that monitors tables and performs actions based on the data within those tables. So it took, I don't know, an hour or something to write a new bot, which was super cool. The we've got a bunch of releases hanging out in the wings. I think that's probably the other big news item. Like the Hyperion client itself is complete. It is unreleased, but it's working. If you manually installed it from the thing, it wraps all of the API endpoints from Hyperion, except for a couple that we couldn't find being hosted anywhere. So if you end up using it and you get an exception thrown, you try to like call one of those methods and it says, this isn't implemented yet. If you could pass us along where we could access that API for testing against, we will implement those functions. But otherwise, I think all but 2 or 3 methods are available. We're not even sure, like we're not Hyperion operators, so we don't even know what is current, like what most people use with Hyperion. So we're taking our best shot at that, basically. It'll wrap all the responses though in antelope types. It takes antelope types as inputs. It's just basically a nice wrapper. If you're working within the Wharf stack, it is probably the easiest way to now interact with Hyperion without having to like cast things to strings and numbers and like go back to JavaScript land to use the other SDKs that are out there. Definitely welcome contributions there as well. Got one for Robo as well. We decided to specifically name it Robo instead of pretending it's like the V1 history plugin, since the only V1 history plugin at this point is Robo. So this is, again, one of these packages that's completed. It's sitting there. It's not published yet, but it's good to go. We have the resource plugin, which is also done. It's not on this page. Bunch of new packages that right now are kind of waiting on a new version of the Antelope library to be published. We've got like this big dependency tree of things that need to be updated. And right now we're kind of just waiting on like one bug fix and some code reviews to actually start that chain of publishing. So there's a bunch of things in the wings that are going to be getting 1.0 releases in the not too distant future. That were all part of the same milestone as the atomic assets thing, which that's the only part remaining for that one milestone. So I don't know if there've been a whole lot of other updates. There's still changes coming to the website as always. The wallet plugins, I think we published some versions last week, but we might have also talked about that last week, about how the Anchor plugin is now like feature parity with what we had in our old SDK, AnchorLink. The whole QR code and reconnect thing is now there, which has been missing since we launched it originally. Yeah, I mean, I am pretty sure that encompasses everything. Just to quickly run through the list of releases that are coming, that we're not in any release to put, or we're not in a rush to push these releases out, but they are ready, essentially. We want to try to publish them. We want to do this big publish that is the releases, the documentation, and potentially some guides, and then making sure we have all the dependencies resolved. That's going to be the session kit, the contract kit, the account kit, the command line tool, all these API clients for Hyperion, for Robo, for resources. There's another one I'm forgetting as well. I think a generic resource provider one might be in there. And then I don't think any of the wallet plugins have been held back. So that's 8 or 9 releases that are basically done, that are all kind of waiting in the wings for documentation to be ready so that we can publish it.
The fix for the ABI types, is that also inside of those releases?
The fix to what?
ABI.
Yes, I believe so. Was that? I think the last I knew, I replied to your message and I said that it was in a next tag release. And I thought it was a fix. Was it a fix?
I haven't tested it.
Okay. I think for my testing, it did fix it. So as long as that PR gets merged in, which is the action results, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. It's not merged yet, but as far as I know, this will be part of that bigger release. If you need it, it's in that next tag, I guess is.
I did look at I visually looked at the contract that you posted, and I saw that it was there on the ABI. So that's good enough for me.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, I think it'll be there. We'll be, I think I'm just waiting on an internal review just to make sure I'm not going to break anything with that commit.
We did talk about something related to this in the last meeting. So I had a note to go back internally and talk about the fact that the return types were missing on the ABI, but now in retrospect, it seems like they were missing on the ABI because they just weren't on that ABI interface. So it looks like it would be a lot easier now to infer the type of a returned value and to know if there is a return value for an action and be able to return that directly from Wharf.
Oh, that's true. I will have to potentially open an issue on the command line tool then. Or we'll have to do some testing on it because it's possible that the command line tool might already do that when it's upgraded with this newer version of the antelope library. Because as far as I know, they just look like actions to the command line tool and to the contract kit.
Right.
So in theory, yeah, they should type
Question
them.
here would be, how can we make the returned value easily accessible to the developer who's integrating this stuff into their front end? Like, is there some kind of destructuring we can do from the object? Maybe it's not nested so deeply inside of the processed actions, or I don't know how to do it because it's potentially a multiple array of returned values from the inlines as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because right now they got to go dig through the result and the traces and yeah. I mean, maybe we can add like a helper method to the transaction result or something like that. That's like get values or something like that.
Because in the developers chat, we've already seen people just like re-rolling that over and over again, just mapping through it and trying to fetch the hexes or the return values.
Yeah. That makes sense. I don't have an answer yet, but I will make sure we take a look at that. I'm going to quickly jot myself a note. Cool. All these new things that we've never used return values yet, and it feels like developers are just now starting to get used to that or starting to use them, at least from what I've seen in the Telegram chats. So
we use them and like use more of, instead of making like, say like 6-7 calls to an API, you can make one read only where that will just with a return value that will read from different tables and different things and return you one response.
Yeah, that sounds really useful. It's basically what get account does, right? Because get account kind of queries a whole bunch of tables and just packs that up into a custom API.
It's like user defined, so you can just create.
Yeah.
This is the way that I've been using them. So you can create a method that's like, get tasks for a to-do app, and then it'll just go through all the tables and package it up neatly like you'd expect. So
That's
it's
awesome.
kind of like
exactly because you
an ORM.
Because you define all your return types as well, so you can do pretty much anything.
And does the ABI describe that pretty accurately? Like what's going to come back?
So what it does, exactly. You if it's a raw type, it'll just give you back the raw type like it would in any other place in the ABI, like a parameter. And then if you have something which is custom defined, like a struct or anything, it'll put it up at the top in the structs and then link that down at the return types.
Nice. sounds like we might even want to, well, I don't know. I guess we can leave it as action for now. Though we might get to a point where we need to like make a new method on the contract kit that's like, I don't know, read only or something. You call read only on the contract and you pass the action name instead of calling action and passing the action name. And then it knows bother with authorizations. I don't need to bother with the plugins and all that other stuff. And I can just call this against the read only endpoint and calculate the values. The things that we don't really have in scope, but that would be super useful.
Yeah, like I can show you some examples of that if it helps, of like the use it with read only, but it can be used in normal transactions as well.
Yeah. I feel free to like pass me on some potential calls against contracts that might return more complex data structures. Those would definitely be useful tests. I think the only tests we have are like tests that return like hello world or something.
Yeah, for us it's not exhaustive yet, because we're still like building the read only ones we want, but we have a few.
That's awesome. Cool. Another thought that just came to mind, project-wise, like big picture-wise for Wharf talking about this, we're really starting to focus in on only what's in scope, at least maybe for the month of October. We're going to continue to do like bug fixes and whatever, but we've wandered out of scope enough that it has, I mean, it's part of the contribution as to why we're not done yet at this point. We're both trying to complete the scope of the project as it was defined last November or January or whenever it was. And we're also trying to keep up with all the cool things that are going on that aren't in scope. So the shift over the last 2 weeks or so internally has been, if it is not part of the scope, then we need to put it off for right now, just so that way we can finish everything that's in scope, call the project complete from kind of that business aspect, and then we can shift back to some of the nice to haves, you know, whether or not that fits within whatever comes next. So yeah, I just figured I'd drop that out.
Yeah, that's the only thing that makes sense, like the only approach, like,
yeah,
because you can't, it's not like you will have to stop after, right, the milestones are met. You can always like update it and add whatever you want, but at your own pace, at your own like balance with other things.
Exactly. So we've been very much probably, like, if we were being very strict, there would be a lot less features than there is today, but just because we would be following the project plan to the T. But seeing as how we are constantly like veering off and being like, oh yeah, this part needs to be better than what we planned. And can't keep doing that, because if we just keep doing that, then the project will stretch on for way too long. So we're going to get everything done that we need to get done, and then we'll revisit and come back to this stuff. Some examples of this might be the fact that you can only use send transaction right now, and you can't use send transaction 2. It's because we don't have that broadcast plugin capability to let you switch between different broadcast methods. That's something we want. It's just, it wasn't in the project scope. So, and we haven't done it up until this point. So now we're going to just push that off until the project is complete. So we're going to be heads down on documentation, heads down on these educational materials, and finishing off the last little bits of code that are required for the overall project, just to button up the project as a whole. And then we can move into this new era of Wharf where it is, I don't know if it's paid for. I don't know if it's volunteer work that's going into it, whatever it may be moving forward.
Yeah.
Cool. That is kind of all I have in terms of updates, I believe. You'll notice if you're keeping track of our project board, we've moved a lot of stuff into the icebox. These are things that we would like to do, or we think are good things for the project. It's just they are out of scope at this point. Like this is for internet, like localizing the website. The localization of the actual WharfKit.com website was not in the project scope. It's something we think is needed, but it is getting shoved into the icebox for now, simply because it's not part of the project scope. So these things may exist out here, and it just means we're not doing them as part of the scope of the project because they weren't in that original vision. The to-do and the no status we haven't classified yet. And to-do is things we've identified that we still have yet to do to meet the needs of the scope of the project. So we're using this to kind of move things back and forth. It gets updated every couple days whenever we're changing things. So if you do need a good overview of it all, it is on the WharfKit GitHub organization, and it is the only project listed under there. Website. Oh, sorry. I got super distracted right there. It's like, what's this? So yeah, is there anything you guys want to talk about today in terms of code, in terms of how things are done, in terms of features we need to add, or whatever it may be? Kind of floor is open.
Maybe we just touch on that. I was just reading briefly on the autocorrect plugin. What does that exactly do? Like it tries your transaction and then like using your own resources and then tries to tell you what other actions you need to bundle, or?
Yeah, it is. It uses the compute transaction API endpoint. It will just take the raw transaction as the app requests and throw it against that and see if it throws any errors related to CPU, net, or RAM. If it'll then interpret those errors and make suggestions on how to correct the transaction to make the transaction successful. It currently only works with PowerUp. So EOS is really the only network it actually works on. And that is because it doesn't work as well for Rex, and it doesn't really work at all for staking. I mean, it could in theory, but the PowerUp model is just so much better for these on-the-fly corrections, especially when it comes to CPU or net. We can, if we submit the transaction to the compute transaction endpoint and it says you're microseconds short on CPU, we can use PowerUp to immediately purchase, using the user's balance, that 100 microseconds of CPU. For staking, trying to calculate how much you need to stake for 100 microseconds is not great. The estimates are really fuzzy, and then it's a permanent lockup. Well, not permanent, but it's until you undo it lockup. And the same goes with Rex. You're renting for 30 days instead of 24 hours. So yeah, that's basically what it does. Yeah,
it should be easier to calculate in if you have leeway off. If you have leeway on, like forget about it.
Yeah,
like, it's just going to be more complex,
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think we could potentially add staking or Rex into that model. It's not developed currently. I think there's some comments in the code about where they should be written and injected in. But as of right now, it handles PowerUp and RAM purchases. So,
but why does it need multiple calls? Like, wasn't that someone was saying it does multiple calls sometimes? Why would you need multiple calls?
It's because the error messages they don't stack. Like let's say,
but like for example, I in the MetaMask provider for UX Network, I use Compute API, and the way I do it is with Compute API, you don't need to sign anything, so you can do whatever you want. So what I do is I put a ton of CPU and a ton of net. Like basically, I include like a pre-action that stakes a ton of net and a ton of CPU, like from EOS.io, for example, to the user. That way, like, since you don't need permissions, that will make sure that you won't get a CPU or net failure. And then when you either a RAM failure and potentially how much CPU and net was needed.
That could be an interesting way to do it.
And then you check the CPU against what they have to make sure it didn't use more. And then you can know if you want to add CPU, but you already caught the RAM, which is the one you won't catch initially.
Yeah. No, I guess I hadn't thought about using it that way. We could potentially look at modifying it to go that route. Yeah, we were just catching the individual errors. So it was recursively calling until it didn't get an error, is how it functions right now.
Yeah, I think what I was doing is I was also adding RAM. Like I was adding CPU, net, and RAM before like the action itself. So I make sure it passes, and just look at like the logs of how much RAM was consumed and how much CPU and net was used, and use that to decide what.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. You do a known.
Is there any other reason to call compute transaction except for CPU, net, and RAM?
Like in general?
Well, I'm wondering if we go back internally and say, hey, we should just catch all of these errors instead of one. Is there any other that wouldn't be already caught within this workaround? Because if not, then basically the workaround is just the simplest way forward.
I can't think of. I mean, people can use it to do read-only transactions and things like that, I believe, but
Only transaction.
yes. So long as
But read-only, you cannot do read-only on a non-read-only, right? Like in the sense that read-only will not give you the results of a transaction that will actually alter the state, like compute does.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the primary purpose of compute transaction, is A, just to make sure it's successful, and B, to give you the errors that may have occurred. Maybe it would be useful for testing auth, like and a require auth check. We could intercept and throw auth errors before it even reached the user's wallet. Like that might be another potential use, but
I think auth. Oh, actually, yeah, auth would be checked. It's more like just no keys are verified, but you still need to put like in the transaction who's there.
Yeah. Like if you try to call a system contract action that's limited to only EOS.IO prods or something, I'm assuming compute transaction will fail there. And then
right, unless you put EOS.IO permission, like in the action.
Right.
You just have to put it in the stack, in the authorization stack.
True. We're not using it for that purpose right now. All we're using it for is resource calculations, but that's the only other thing I imagine it could be useful for.
And of course, spammers that might just spam faster. Although like compute API, unlike read-only, it's not parallelized because it actually applies it to the like blocks DB and then unrolls it.
I guess this is really, it could be used, I'm hesitant to say this out loud on a recorded call, but it could be used as a way to gauge your subjective billing. Or
right,
I guess
of the API, of the API endpoint.
Yeah, without actually submitting anything.
I don't know for a fact, but I'm guessing that it goes around the subjective billing pathways.
I'm not entirely sure.
Well, it's gonna be it's gonna be the subjective billing. Like what you're gonna get back is locally on that node, not what the actual billing will be on a producer node. So, for example, if you want to do automated tests of API endpoints, I missed that.
If you spam it, it's not going to add subjective billing to you.
What do you mean? Like, I'm not following. Like, are you meaning what you're gonna get charged for that? Like, you're billing based on like what the API returns or something else?
Well, there's the two charges. There's the one that's you're charged on when you're finally processed by a block producer, and then there's the subjective billing, which you're
Right.
charged on the nodes.
Which is the API, but you're not
Right.
charged that on the node. It's
You're
just like
right.
what
You're not
what
charged.
they estimate. Yeah.
It's the virtual
So,
charge.
exactly, it's just telling you what this node would charge if it was the one producing, and you hope that the node has similar specs to the producer to get like a relatively accurate. Else can drop it before it reaches and all that stuff. But yeah, this, like, for example, is a good way, like Compute API, now that you mention it, is a good way to do automated, like maybe EOS mechanics or some other stuff, like where you stress test the API nodes versus like only getting the info on the producer.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if it records that subjective billing amount, which, considering there's multiple things we call subjective billing, this is confusing. We should probably rename one of them. Like maybe one of them's local billing or something. The billing, you are billed
Firewall.
locally. Yeah. But I don't know if Compute records that billing against the API when you use Compute transaction.
Right. And this would be the problem where a lot of people are suffering because they don't know that node has them billed at a much higher rate than they actually are billed, and then isn't completing their transactions, right? This is when transactions
Right.
get lost in the network. And I wonder if Compute just circumvents that.
It must. I've got to believe it does, though I could be completely wrong here, because otherwise,
It would give bad result.
Yeah.
What are the different types of subjective billing? I thought it's just what like a node returns for you versus what the producer does.
Well, that's one, but the other one is that you're applied billing in each node locally so that it's attempting to prevent spam across the network in case you're trying to like do transactions that fail only later. So you might have like an API node and it goes through the API node successfully, but you have a timer on your smart contract that fails it a second later. And then that would fail on a BP node and consume time of the BP node. It's a prevention attack.
Interesting. I didn't know about that.
Action would never run on a BP node, so it doesn't make sense that would be there anyway.
Yeah,
exactly. So, and the protection against compute transaction really just needs to be at one layer above node EOS, like throttle it per IP or something. And if it's a huge problem, then set up a dedicated node and route compute transaction to that instead of having it be on your actual push transaction node. So that way you have like this estimation node.
Well, I mean, the way that this was originally used is that I'm guessing there were like arbitrage bots or something like that, which were the transaction was arbitraging successfully on the API node, but by the time it got to the BP node, the arbitrage was no longer valid because the transaction isn't ordered the same as it would be on an API node. And then it would fail there. And then by chance that happened to showcase not a vulnerability, but a way to overload nodes. I guess kind of a vulnerability. But it seems like compute transaction in this case might be a way to have the same. I guess not, because you're still not sending the transactions to the BPs. It's just dying at the API node.
It at least, I mean, if those types of bots at least used compute transaction and like knew that it wasn't going to be forward on, the non-malicious versions of that would at least have a path forward to kind of do that without unintentional upstream consequences.
They're white hat arbitrage bots.
Yeah, right.
The best is to have machines in every data center that's close to the BP's producer, where you try to figure it out, and you just route based on the schedule.
But you don't actually know
the-
where the BP node is.
Right,
It's private.
you can easily assume that like their BP is well meshed to their public API node. For
Yeah, that's true.
example. And you can
Well,
target
and-
that, and you have a higher chance to get there a little bit faster, especially if you're in the same location. Like you can figure it out, get close latency to them and stuff.
And there is, I mean, I think this has largely been mitigated at the BP layer. Like I know at least we see this on Wax a decent amount, where like floods of transactions will cause certain BPs to enter this like failure cycle where they are not including transactions in their blocks. But simply by adding a node in between your API and your BP, like it acts as kind of a gateway node. And then that is the one that, it takes those subjective billing hits and prevents it from actually happening at the BP node, and acts as kind of a firewall for successful transactions to get through.
And that's super common in like quote unquote modern BP infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. So you can tell whenever it happens and people drop down to nothing, it's because their BP node is getting a bunch of subjectively failing things, and their BP node's just dealing with them, and that's why no real transactions get in. So at least that's
I haven't seen that in a while. No common occurrence.
It happens on Wax. I mean, it probably happened a week or two ago. I want to say we're 2 or 3 BPs. Yeah. It's busy over there, they're the stress test right now. So lots of game activity and whatever that means.
It's because they're lacking those filter/canary nodes in the middle of the BP infrastructure, because that shouldn't be happening at this point.
Yeah, it's gotta be. I mean, I don't know another reason why it would be. And I don't obviously know the internals of how they're set up, but if their BP is peered to someone that's not filtering for them, then they're getting that flood of activity and just can't include everything at the appropriate times.
Keep in mind for Wax, like you need a ton of RAM, a ton of space. So just to have another, node, like each node really matters there compared to like almost any other chain. So people, I'm sure, try to cheap out and never.
Yep.
Like what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
That's a really actually.
Yeah, somewhere between 100 to 110 gigs of RAM per node.
Right, but you don't necessarily need that for the purposes of that filter node.
We do.
Because it's gonna fail the subjective, it won't pass it to the producer, no?
You don't need to record the state on those nodes. You just need to know what it's going to consume and if it's going to fail.
I don't think that there's any software that does that at this point.
There isn't.
It would be nice if there was.
There's a term of like winterization that's been we've been working on, and I think for this specific case, it might be a really interesting way to lower costs, because I'm sure that every big BP is running at least one of those nodes somewhere in their stack.
Yeah. Honestly, I've looked at the Wharf P2P client and have thought about trying to write something there where you could just run a Node.js script that would both listen and then rebroadcast the P2P network, and then somehow be able to filter out transactions that would fail. But you can't really do that without state. You need the state to be able to evaluate the transaction so I don't know how that would work. The P2P client and Wharf could do the in and the out part. It's just the evaluating of transactions against current state. That's the hard part. And then maintaining state.
I'm not really sure if you do need state.
I don't know how else you'd validate that a transaction would succeed.
Yeah, I guess that's the biggest problem there is it happens when it fails. I don't know. I need to think about it. It's an interesting problem.
It really is, but it would be nice to be able to have super lightweight P2P nodes that could act as filters. They're
firewall in the middle.
Yep. And it doesn't have to be the full Node.io Sleep implementation. It could just be some lightweight thing, and that would be Those would also be great to like live out on the edges of infrastructure. Like here's our public endpoint, and it is actually just like some other application
Right.
that is not consuming state. It's just it's a relay.
Edge API nodes, you mean?
Basically. It's like
if it's
an
P2P, I
Nginx or an
think
HA
that's
proxy.
already. Yeah, if it's P2P, I don't think it's necessarily complicated, because at that point you're not like trying to understand what's going on there. You're just like passing it from one to another.
You can give, and you're probably only connected to like one node, which is your own infrastructure.
At that point, you might as well just use Nginx or HA proxy, though. You don't have to write anything. If you want to get in like the custom logic and be able to like filter and whatever, that's where some little P2P client would be really useful. So ever since Bart wrote that and submitted the PR for the P2P client, I've been trying to think of an easy way to do that, but it almost all requires state, which is the elephant.
So that's the interesting thing, is I think that you could probably set up some kind of, like, how would this work in a Web 2 world? You would have a node on the edge, and then you'd have a database probably away from the edge, even though it should probably be close to the edge. But you'd have it away from the edge, and it would just go fetch what it needs from the database, not the entire database, just what it needs. Yeah. I don't know how we accomplish that here to be able to fetch partition state just for this transaction.
Yeah. Sounds like it would be an interesting challenge, though.
Yeah. But wow, we veered off the course here with this call.
Yeah. We're having a mini operators call now. I've been missing those for months now, so it's welcome.
Just getting out some of that release tension.
Yeah, right. I'm trying to walk back now and figure out how we got here and if there was anything we needed to pick up along the way.
Question here from, I don't know if we addressed it, include null in the chat, is talking about API client and Leap for account object changes.
We still have an open issue to get all of the new endpoints added. I know those aren't in scope right now, so I guess, as much as I hate to say it, they're going to have to wait. We should absolutely have parity between what's available in the Leap 4 and Leap 5 in the Antelope Libraries API client, but they don't exist. There is I think there's an outstanding issue and it might not even be a complete list. Yeah, this is what I know of that is currently missing. Like the endpoints themselves don't exist in the API client and they need to be added. So I've been chipping away at them. Like you can see there was in April a PR that added a couple of them, but it just hasn't been prioritized.
There's kind of a discussion. Yeah, so this one happens to be new values.
Schedule.
What was that?
That's a new endpoint, or there's new values inside of the return object?
The ones I have listed here are endpoints that just aren't implemented.
Well, so exactly. So what include null is talking about is there's new properties inside of the account object. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the ABI properties, how it's always going to be a moving target.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who wants to utilize that stuff has to wait for an upgrade from WharfKit, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Even results, right?
It would be super nice if Leap published some ABIs or something of what their API endpoints responded with, and we could just interpret those instead of having to hard code all of this. Because right now, whenever an API endpoint...
They are, but they're manually coded. So they're the YAML files, but they're not maintained to the degree that would be helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's the same situation here, is that it is just whenever something changes in Node.eos, well, like we don't even know that these changes happened. Like it's not documented well anywhere. It's not like, oh, there's a new field on this API response. And then we need to, when we discover that they're missing, we have to go back in and modify uh, the Antelope library to include those. So I think this is maybe somewhere that we could have a lot better pipeline, that if a field changes, gets added, gets removed from any API endpoint, there's a way to, there's either a change log, maybe that's the easiest way, that's published. So that way there's something manually to follow along with, or B, there's something published that can then just be ingested by the library to regenerate these things. Because in the Antelope library, all we do, if you go into the API folder, you go into v1 and you go to types, we are just defining all of these objects as ABI objects, essentially as structs.
Those are manually written, right? They're not generated.
Correct. There's nowhere to generate them from. So we need to, yeah.
I'd like to wait for like Wharf to officially release as a final product. And then I'd like to revisit this, because I think that finding a way for us to be able to trickle that down not only would be beneficial for Wharf, but probably for a lot of the others. I'm very, very hesitant to say that it would be in the documentation, because I don't believe that it belongs there. I think it serves a different target. But I like the idea of a change log, because currently all we have is the release notes, and I don't think they're detailed enough or have that kind of information in them enough to be useful in this case. They're also very verbose.
I very much agree. And ideally, in an ideal world, like the minute a new release candidate for Leap comes out that has these changes, we have a release candidate for Wharf or for this Antelope library that also includes those changes, so they're immediately usable.
I think that's a really hard ask, though.
Then the node can return, like from an API call to the node.
Actually, that's a really interesting point, because basically the node knows all of the interfaces. It would just have to convert them to JSON and return them.
And
I think that would be a big
node,
lift.
So like you don't want to maintain different like lists.
Why would it be different per node? It'd be different per node EOS.
I'm saying yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Like per node EOS, like depending on who you're connecting to, that node EOS could support more calls or added fields in it, because it's like newer potentially. So it's like would be ideal. That would knows for sure, because it requires a node to connect to. It gets it from there and knows for sure that's what's supported there, and that's what like the types are.
Yeah, and we could make that the initial call before anything else. Like if you're going to make an API call, we call this thing first, and then we like dynamically build the response types based on that. I don't know. That's going to really screw with TypeScript, because TypeScript won't have any idea what it is. But that's, yeah, I don't know. I mean,
it might be interesting to go through the C++ code and just find where they're written, where these interfaces are written, because that's really the source of truth there.
Mm-hmm.
And then just take those out and convert them into something, because I don't know about putting them in the node. It doesn't really make sense, because you need to call it for generation. It's not at runtime, right? It's at compile time.
Yeah. If the developer wants to know what they are and like get the types, and yeah, we need it at compile time. So it might be something similar to like the contract kit, where it goes out and fetches an ABI, interprets it, and then generates code. I mean, this looks incredibly similar to what the command line tool outputs. It's just building structs in a lot of ways. So,
but the gotcha here is that we don't have an API for all of these internal structs inside of the Leap C++ code.
And that's, I mean, when we wrote all of these by hand, that's what we did, is we just dug through the source code It's just we don't know when the source code changes and when we need to update these things. So,
Well, this is a problem that we've been facing for a while, is that Leap is the standard instead of Leap being created off of the standard.
Yes. Yeah, that's really accurate.
And that's why I'm to expose that standard for other things that need to consume it one way or another. Maybe it's something that specific people need to turn on, or even if you use it for generation or updating work library, like it has many uses.
Well, I'd like to see it as a script, actually, inside of Leap, because I'm wondering, we don't really want to add more complexity to the actual Leap infrastructure, and I think the only time you're ever going to need this is the one. Yeah, something like that, exactly, like some kind of command line.
I like the idea of it potentially existing outside, like the authority on what it should be should exist outside of Leap, and then Leap should follow it, and then Wharf should follow it. So that way we all agree to change the standard, and then separate development teams and anybody following the standard can just go out and be like, okay, this was approved, this was changed, this is now the standard. Now let's update everything everywhere based on the standard.
And other networks have proved that is a very effective system. Like if you look at the Ethereum system, all of the parity and all the various different nodes, they follow exactly that type of system.
Yep. And I mean, this goes back to the API plus blue paper, where we wrote that we really need API standards around all of this stuff. And we were proposing like a version 2, but maybe the first step is just to standardize version 1. And then once we have that standardized and everybody's following it, then we can propose version 2 later. Because our APIs honestly are just a mess.
All right, I gotta hop off, guys. Sorry.
That's cool. We can wrap it up here. Thank you guys for jumping in, and we will continue on.